I don't know. Okay, so let's do it on yours then.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not the one that came up with this thing.
No worries. Technology can get really complex sometimes.
Okay, we'll leave that. Well, hello, Diane, officially. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today. So we are live on my YouTube channel. My name is Dee. My pronouns are they, them. I am a queer Mexican spiritual life coach for minorities. And this is my friend Daniela. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Daniela. I am a lifestyle coach for mixed women of color that are looking to start their decolonization lifestyles. So that's a lot.
When I was doing the Instagram story to promote this, I was like,
what's the rest of it?
Mixed woman of But that's so exciting. I would love to know, like, let's just talk about our journeys. I would love to know kind of what your background is and what got you started on this journey.
Sure. So for me, it's I think for a lot of people of color, it's something that's always been in your life, but you don't realize what it is that's going on. So it was little things like growing up, and my dad being like, "Oh, we don't talk to the cops because they protect property, not people," and having stuff like that coming in. You know, we don't watch TV. We didn't have a TV for the longest time because he's like, I don't like how people of color, and he didn't say it like that. We spoke Spanish, but he's like, I don't like how they portray people of color in these TV shows, especially men and stuff like that. So it's all these things that were in my brain. But it wasn't really until and then I worked with a lot of minority groups, always recognizing that I came from an underserved community and not knowing it in those words, because that's another thing. The language wasn't there. It was just like, you're broke, but you can't tell you're broke when everybody else is broke.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to go to university, and I'm like, well, I have to contribute. How do I continue to contribute to these communities? Because I have an overwhelming sense of privilege. When I was a kid, I'm like, we didn't have extra money because when we did, it went back home. I'm like, those guys are starving, in Central America. I have food, I have an education, we have a car. Like, we don't need to go to Six Flags or get a chocolate bar. Like, that's ridiculous. So got to university, I kept on contributing to the communities there, got a degree in intercultural studies, because for me it was really important to show people from communities like mine how they could integrate into the main community. So that sense of there being two communities and one being the dominant one, and getting to that would provide success was a big thing for me. And then I worked a lot one-on-one with people. Eventually I got for like the last 7-ish years working on reserves or reservations with Indigenous youth, and always with the focus of how do we retain our culture while also integrating into this dominant culture. I tried getting into policy, got my master's in art for social change, which is consulting with communities through arts, to then change things on a bigger scale, because a lot of the work I was doing was one-on-one. Then realized the system was messed up.
Yep.
So I went, and I was always attending protests and rallies, and it was at one of these things that I was with a white friend that just said some stuff that just hit me. I'm like, how the heck do you think this of me, of the people that you're here to support? Like, what is going on? And so I asked a friend of mine, I'm like, this happened and I can't get out of my brain. And she's like, well, this and this and this is what it is. These systems of oppression, all these terms that I had never heard of. So I dove deep into it and realized this is everything I've ever been trying to address. I just didn't have the language and didn't realize that there was other folks trying to address it in similar or different ways. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm like, well, how do I help people get this language? And that's why I think my title sounds big, because I'm like, there's some things you can't simplify. There's no other word for decolonization.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's kind of, well, what does education around that look like?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my journey with all that. How about you?
Yeah, so really quick before we jump into kind of my side of things, let's talk a little bit, like, let's just briefly define decolonization, because I'm sure a lot of folks out there don't even know what that means. And then after I share my story, we can jump more into the topic. So what would you define decolonization, kind of just in simple layman's terms?
That's another tricky one, because it's the dismantling of colonization.
Mm-hmm.
What is colonization? And that stands on capitalism. It's a system of capitalism married with a system of supremacy.
Yes.
So the fact we as humans can do whatever we want, but the hierarchies within that is its own thing. So that is decolonization, getting rid of capitalism and getting rid of this idea of superiority.
Yeah. So it completely stems back to, if anyone has been watching my YouTube channels consistently, I talked about this recently with my video about Thanksgiving, and my video about Columbus Day, because that's where it stems from, is these colonizers coming into, mainly, in our case, we're talking more about indigenous cultures in the Americas, but it applies to the entire world, where these white colonizers would come in and just take what they wanted and oppress the people in order to build this hierarchy. And so we're trying to dismantle that. And so my story with that, I always identify myself as a queer Mexican. My mom is from Mexico. Her roots are indigenous from the Nahuatl tribe and from Spain. And then my dad is white from America. He is just like a mix of everything. And so I have, I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, but just this very complex identity where it's very layered and you don't quite know how to narrow it down and simplify it. And so the most simple term that I've found is Mexican or Mexican American. And my whole journey started with, like, I remember being a kid and just distinctly realizing how different, especially the cultures were, especially my relatives on both sides, seeing how, we would visit my family in Mexico. And even though, they are doing fine for themselves, there was still this very clear disparity between my dad's white American family versus my mom's Mexican family, and the kinds of stories that I would hear, my mom having to support her family when she was a teenager, being the sole breadwinner, versus my dad in the meantime having more of a traditional high school and then going off to college. Those kinds of distinction, I remember feeling very, like, hyper aware of those distinctions between the two sides of my family. And then just, the microaggressions and stuff like that kind of made me more and more aware. And when I was especially a teenager, I, excuse me, I kind of, the angsty teenager type of stereotype, but it was not just me being angsty about the world in general. It was more directed at these injustices that I was looking at around me. And over the years, I just became more and more passionate about these issues of activism and equality, and realizing, like you said, how, like, fucked up the system is to completely disempower these marginalized communities, and how, as people of color, I also work with a lot of queer people, women in general, you have to work so much harder than the person that's just placed on top by virtue of who they are. And so I just found that extremely unfair, and kind of fell into this rabbit hole of feminism and activism for racial inequality and these sorts of things. And it's evolved into, now I'm studying international studies with an emphasis in nonprofit organization management, as well as working more one-on-one with people within my coaching business, because I am just so overly passionate about decolonization and being able to empower people who are kind of have been oppressed by this systematic inequality.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that having that opportunity that you did to go back to Mexico and see your dad's side is super, I don't want to say cool, but like it just brings a lot, it just really shows you what's going on, where
Yeah.
you can see both sides, and you can really see them living within you, which I think is really interesting, because for me, that's something that came really late in life, was realizing that I had European ancestors, besides a few scraggly, like
Yeah.
great grandparents that might have been white. It's like, oh no, I'm half white. Where did this come from? And how did that get here?
Yeah, yeah. And so I have a very clear instance that kind of marked that for me. Like I said, I grew up every summer going to visit my mom's family in Mexico and then seeing my dad's family here. And so I always had kind of that delineation between the two. But when I was 18, I was living with my grandparents here in the United States, my white paternal grandparents. And I remember one time I was having a conversation with my paternal grandma, and she said something along the lines of, why do you and your sister identify more as Mexican if you're half white? Why can't you embrace being American the same way? And I just was very taken aback, first off, because I hadn't felt like I was, embracing one more over the other. But I explained it to her. Well, when I'm in America, my Mexican half is the minority. But when I'm in Mexico, my American half is the minority. It's not the same thing. I didn't go into the systems and all that kind of stuff and explain the complexity of that. But it was just a very interesting kind of point of view that I was getting from someone who, to this day, still doesn't quite understand the complexity of my identity and what that really means. It's not just, oh, my mom is Mexican, my dad is white. It goes so much deeper than, speaking Spanish and English. And so I think that was kind of the really, that was kind of the turning point when I was 18 at the time, when I was like, okay, I need to really be like vocal about what this means for me, and what my identity is, and why it matters. Because there's so much misunderstanding, particularly with those that are in a privileged position, to kind of erase our identities and expect us to assimilate, which is not, which is something that I'm very heavily opposed to.
Very sure. Yeah, I think that's fair.
I am curious to hear, because you live in Canada. Have you always lived in Canada?
Yeah, I moved here when I was 2, but I did live in the States for 5 years when I was doing my undergrad.
Okay.
So
Where in the
that
States?
was Missouri.
Oh,
So that
interesting.
was quite interesting.
I would love to hear your perspective on kind of some of the similarities and differences between how America versus Canada treats its marginalized communities.
Yeah, totally. I live in Vancouver, which is the original lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. They all have overlapping not claims, because they were not claims, but they're overlapping territories, because at different seasons they would go hunting in different areas, yet their village concentrations were in certain areas at certain times. And then there were more than 3 nations, is my understanding. But when the government started grouping everybody into Indian bands for a government registration, they kind of grouped all these folks into 3 different bands, even though there was many more. And there's 2 language groups, so that was also an overlapping issue. But growing up, I grew up in a like I said, a low income neighborhood, and so it was super diverse. I think yeah, there was no majority there. And then I went to a school that was predominantly Filipino, so again, there was no white versus minorities. And my whole So my low income neighborhood was like, a couple blocks, but then in the larger area, it's also the Punjabi village or Punjabi market, which is
Mm.
predominantly South Asian folks from India. So again, it was my experience growing up was super diverse. I knew Latinos were in the minority. There was no Latinx folks here, but never did I see brown versus white. We were all just different shades of brown, and you really had to go close to figure out what kind of brown you were. um, and so growing up, it was more about what foods you ate or when you celebrated that would differentiate you. And that was as far as I could see, again, because I was a kid, I'm like, oh, Diwali, which happens in late fall around Halloween. I'm like, all the Indian folks have candles out in their yards. I love this. I'm going to go hang out. They give you little moon cakes. A lot of my friends in my neighborhood were obviously Indian. So you'd have that, or some of our local native neighbors would go to powwows, and we're like, oh, we're gonna hit up a powwow because they happened all over the area. It wasn't as supported back then as it is now, but it was still something I grew up with. So it was powwows, it was Chinese New Year, let's go to the parade. So growing up, I saw a lot of diversity, and I remember thinking once when my friend said they were hosting Chinese New Year and all the stuff they were doing, I'm like, oh, of course, because you're Asian, and it hadn't really clicked yet.
Yeah.
But when I went to the States, I really saw how different you could have the white versus anybody else relationship, that dynamic. Because I went to a school where it was 6 colored folks that were there, and they called us colored, and that is why I use that word. And it was to encompass anybody. They also had rules against interracial dating until 96. And for me, that was shocking. And the fact that I would get in trouble a lot because of my dress and stuff like that when I was following the dress code. It was a pretty conservative school. I was like, what on earth? Like I've always been the good kid. I got a scholarship, a full ride to this school because I was the good kid. And now I'm the bad kid. And that was shocking to me because I'm like, I'm not trying to be bad. I'm trying to follow the rules, but I'm not good enough. And so this sense of not being good enough really lasted. And I'm like, you know what? I'm here for a degree. I can't afford one. So we're going to stick it out. And I did, and came back to Canada after that. I had the opportunity to stay in the States for another year. And I was like, heck no, to see if I could get a job and, whatever. But after that experience, I'm like, no, dude, this is not what it is. And so coming back, that experience of this is racism really stuck in my brain. Getting served in restaurants. I remember thinking, what did Martin Luther King do? Because it's not showing up for me here. There was a lot of segregation between friend groups, and having to identify what friend groups was safe for me was completely new. And checking in, if I want to go to your Thanksgiving dinner, are your parents, do they know my color? Because I know that's a huge issue down here.
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff was very interesting. And then when I came back and started deep diving into colonialism and a lot of these things, I was like, no, this is bad in Canada too, but we're very British about it, So it is systemic, but we don't call it redlining, no people of color, whatever it is in this neighborhood. It's like, there's no, it's, you don't fit that, you can't get the loan or whatever. It's a lot more disguised, more sinister. That's what it is. It's more insidious. It's everywhere, just as bad as it is in the States, but people don't throw it in your face as much.
They're a lot more polite about it. It's polite racism.
Yeah. So, which is worse because you can't get rid of it because people don't realize that they're racist. They think they're being polite. And I'm like, it's not polite.
Yeah.
So that's been my experience. And in most recent years, I think since the Occupy movement and a lot of the environmentalist folks and all those, it's really come up in Canada, and the Indigenous communities that have been fighting for all these things all this time have gotten more support from settler communities. And so now it's, hands down, you do not have a meeting without acknowledging whose lands you're on and who you are on these lands. They're always at the front of events. And if they're not, it's like, well, who else, why else would you have anybody? Like, who are you as an organization, So a lot of that's become mainstream, and some of it is performative because you can have somebody welcome you to their lands, but it doesn't mean that your company as a whole isn't, sticking pipelines through their territories and other places. So it's, yeah, it's become very interesting now. So that's my experience here compared to the States.
Yeah, I've only visited, I was in Toronto and Niagara Falls for like 3 days. So I don't know too much about the differences, but what you're describing with regards to the community, like the differences in how communities are treated in the United States is very, like it very much echoes my own experience. And so just to give a little bit of background, I currently live in Utah. This is mainly where I've been raised. I was born here. This is where my dad's family is from. And Utah is a very interesting place because it was settled by Mormon colonizers, specifically people from the LDS Church. And so it has a very, although a lot of it parallels the history of the rest of the country, it has its kind of own twist on things. And so here, for example, the predominant religion is still the LDS Church, and a big part of the LDS Church is serving missions to recruit people to the church. And so actually that's how my parents met. My dad served his mission in Mexico City and met my mom there. Years later, they got married and moved up here. And so that is a big part of the culture here. And so, you know, when you're 18, 19 years old, it's expected of you to serve for 2 years if you're a guy, a year and a half if you're a girl. I still don't understand why they make that distinction. And you get called to serve either somewhere within the United States or abroad. And so because of that, there's a lot more appreciation for different cultures because, you know, everybody and their dog served a mission. And so they fell in love with the culture of wherever they were serving and kind of bring that back with them. A lot of times, like my dad, they'll even marry someone of the culture and kind of preserve that within their own lives. And so it's beautiful in the sense that there is a lot more appreciation for diversity and diverse cultures. However, because of that, it comes with that caveat of thinking it really instills a white saviorism, a white savior complex of, I went to, I don't know, Taiwan to save the souls of the people there by bringing them into the church. And it still creates this very clear hierarchy of, had I not gone there, typically, you know, most of them are white, had I not gone there as a white person to save these poor brown people, then their souls would be damned. And even though they don't consciously frame it that way and they don't consciously think about it that way, it's still very much a part innately of all of that. And so I've noticed it has led to this clear white supremacy and fetishization of brown people, of non-white people. And so even as young as, you know, I was a teenager and I was getting comments from, you know, I was getting hit on by these missionaries that were serving in my area, who they're not supposed to be doing that. That's very much against the rules, but that they did it anyways. Or I would get hit on by these white guys that had served a mission in a Latin country, and now they're just obsessed with the idea of marrying a Latina. And so it just, like you were saying, it's like, it's all very nice and polite and accepting with this insidious undertone of, I am better than you because I'm white, and so I'm going to fetishize you as an object. And so that's kind of my experience. I've moved 41 times.
Yeah.
Yeah, all over the United States, Mexico, Ecuador, China. So I have a very broad kind of scope of the world, but Utah has been like the place that I've lived most years in. And so, that culture is something that I'm very hyper aware of. And it's very strange to me, but it's that same thing that you were talking about where it's like it's not this overt in your face racism, it's that insidious polite racism that is so much harder to overcome.
Yeah, no, for sure. Um, I think it's education is how we're getting at folks now, to see that insidious racism, because it's not through experiences. It still doesn't resonate. Like I was telling you about that one friend, I'm like, she's at a protest for this specific group and doesn't understand the challenges of this specific group because they're not in your face enough to her.
Mhm.
But I think it's all the books and the reading and all the resources, that give you a bigger understanding of all the systems at play. Because I think maybe
Mhm.
that kind of makes it click more. There are these systems, and this is where you fall within the system, and this is why, it might not be in your face, but it's still within this system that needs to be changed, which I think is a little bit trickier, but also a little bit perhaps more accessible when you are not consistently fearing for your life like some other folks have to.
Yeah. I mean, I just the other day I read this post that put it really, really like simply. I don't remember who it was by, but it said um, something along the lines of like taking on the burden of learning about racism is a huge privilege because the rest of us had to live it. And we still are educating ourselves. We're still doing the work, reading, studying, learning, listening, because there's so many layers to it, and every person within a community has a different experience. Every type of community has a different experience and different struggles. Um, but to, to all the white allies out there that feel burdened by having to learn about these things.
Yeah,
Like,
that's really
come
trickier
on.
for me. I'm like, I'll give you all the resources, but I can't do the digestion for you. And
Yeah,
even the resources I had to learn about my own oppression. So it's that same idea.
exactly.
And I've also had, I think, in talking to folks, that talk about it not being their responsibility, for example, or having to deal with them navigating the world in a female body or being queer and these other oppressions that they might experience, as white folks. But then I think it's very interesting how they're also so steeped in oppression, like we all are, because they don't realize that I'm a queer femme, also navigating these things, and I'm just saying I also have these other ones,
Yeah.
um, which is very interesting because I'm like, are you discounting my, I'm a woman and I'm queer? Because then how do we, what do you see me as? Is the question that pops into my head, which is very interesting because again, you thought that this relationship with this person was because they could see the most obvious parts of you, and yet they can't recognize that either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
it's very interesting because a lot of people who belong to another marginalized community or, what have you, feel like they're exempt. Whether it's a queer person who thinks, I mean, even within your own marginalized community, there's so, like, I see, for example, people of color that are perpetuating the same oppressive systems, and they're like, I can't be racist, I'm brown. And it's like, you can still be perpetuating the same systems, or I can't be, going over to the queer community, I can't be homophobic, I'm queer. And it's like, here's the thing. I think ultimately it comes down to a lot of people having a misunderstanding of what these terms mean, because racism or white supremacy isn't just that picture of like the flat out like KKK members screaming profanities. It's not just that. It's upholding systems of oppression. It's allowing these things to continue and not being able to recognize within yourself, because we all have internalized racism. Every single one of us. Everyone has internalized racism. Everyone has internalized homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, white supremacy. These things are deeply rooted in society. They're not something that you can just transcend. You have to address that within you, whether or not you belong to that marginalized community.
Yeah, so I guess I want to ask you, in your journey of decolonizing or reprogramming these thoughts around internalized oppression, what has your journey been like? Because I know for me, it was like, well, identify one and start there. And it's usually the most accessible one and the one that I have the most information for. What did that look like for you when you started realizing this is a thing that I need to start addressing in my everyday life?
For me, I definitely started with the feminist side of things, because I completely made that same mistake of thinking, well, I'm Mexican, so I can't be racist. And, you know, I love everyone, so I can't be homophobic, stuff like that. And so I started with the feminist side of things, because I realized even though I was raised as a woman, even though I was assigned female at birth, I saw the blatant inequality between the two genders. And this was, you know, leading up to the 2016 elections and the protests that ensued afterwards in the United States, with everyone wearing like the pussy hats and stuff like that. And so it was a much bigger part of the conversation at that point in time. And I remember even as young as 5 years old, at one point, saying that I wanted to be a leader and getting laughed at by older women saying like, only boys are leaders. And so just those little moments where I was just like, and it was just that was my starting point, is to really dive into feminism, and then from there realize like because I recently heard somebody put it in a really interesting way, saying that oppression is like a three-legged stool that's held up by capitalism, white supremacy, and misogyny. And I would even add heteronormativity to that, but being able to then start learning, start with the feminism and then start learning about the complexities of, then I started learning about homophobia. I came out and, started dismantling all of that. And then I got back into kind of my roots of the racism and decolonization and all that kind of stuff, and realizing like, oh shit, I have a lot of internalized racism and white supremacy and stuff like that, where I was talking to a friend recently and I realized flat out I have a weird complex, not even a weird complex, it's very justified. I have a complex about seeing white cis het men as superior to me and feeling like I have to prove myself to them, feeling very defensive around them. And so the moment I get questioned, the moment I'm looked down upon by somebody who is a white cis het male, I get extremely, I call it, I have like little man syndrome. I get extremely defensive and argumentative and lash out. And I've found myself doing that my whole life. And I know that it completely stems from, me, not only the systems of oppression, but like me having a white dad. Because it's like that is who I see as, he's the head of our household. And that's who I feel like I have to prove myself to. It's the daddy issues that I have then projected onto other white cishet men.
Yeah. No, I love that. Did you ever feel like you had to loop back, that something was incomplete, like your unlearning of um the patriarchy as you learn more? You said you went from feminist to queer, and then, or to coming out, and then realizing, oh, but there was more feminist work to be done
All
rather
the
than
time.
just
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at this point, I have stopped viewing it in such a linear path, or trying to separate those different things, because they're all integrated. It's all a part of the same system. And so being able to work on dismantling misogyny and racism and homophobia, those are all a part of the same work. It's all coming down to this person being at the top of the pyramid and pushing everyone else down. And so being able to dismantle that and bring everyone up to that same level is a part of the same journey. I have found at this point that I can't really separate those.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to see if it was the same, because I'm like, I feel like it's spaghetti. You're going on one and then you have to merge onto the other one because they're all lumped up together, and you're like, how do I get to the end of this like bowl?
Yep.
Where am I? So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, like for example, right now I am in Hannah Martin's book club mastermind, and we're reading Hood Feminism, which is about women of color. It's about those two things coexisting, those two systems of oppression coexisting in order to push women and push people of color down. And so then ultimately, if you are both of those things, you're at the bottom of that hierarchy, and you're getting stepped on the most. And then on top of that, since we're both queer, having that added to that, it doesn't really get addressed in a lot of issues, but both of us being queer femmes of color, that's like the trifecta of oppression.
Yeah, no, it's fun. Interesting place to dig out from. I know we're like over time, but could I ask you one other question, and it can be super
Absolutely.
shortly answered? What supports or resources do you have, or that helped you along your journey or keep you on your path? What do you find?
Well, I always have in my Instagram bio and stuff, and within every one of my videos, a list of resources for anti-racism for white people, but obviously anyone can benefit from them. And so being able to have these really simple resources where it's just like you put on a YouTube video or a Netflix movie or something, read a book, allows you to be able to learn about these things without, it makes it a lot more accessible. So I have that, as well as within my coven, the Minority Empowerment Coven, we talk about these things at length. We talk about how it affects us as people, it affects society and the people that we love, as well as kind of the connections that it has to spirituality, because as we know, a lot of spiritual practices have been co-opted from communities of color, from indigenous communities, and just being able to dismantle that with the support of having that spiritual community that we can rely on. And so that is what I provide. Obviously within YouTube and Instagram, I talk about these things, but there's only so much that I can really talk about when it's just kind of me speaking into the void. And so that's why I created the community, so that we can support each other and be able to have these deeper conversation. I would love to know about the resources that you provide.
Well, I guess I was thinking along the lines of what supports do I have personally to keep me
Mm-hmm.
on the path. Resources I provide, I have a list. I'm like, there's podcast authors. I don't know, there must be like 300 or so on my website. But I guess I don't point people to them as much as I should, perhaps. Rather than just in my Instagram lives, I have like not the lives, but the books that I like, and reviews about them, or information about different authors or different folks doing interesting work. And then in my personal life, I think it's having friends that understand where you're coming from, that keep you, they're also doing their research. So when you come to them and say this happened, and you are either too blinded to be able to see what system that situation was operating under because your emotions are too heightened. I have friends that are able to look at that for me, or I do that for them. So I think always exposing myself to education every day. I'm like at least an hour of new education, and then having friends that know you enough to be able to support you through that. And then having groups that you can join, or whatever, to have these conversations, because I really enjoy these conversations. I think they're not happening enough in public,
Yeah.
where people can see this is messy. This is something that you're not going to get right. You can't get something right when the whole system is messed up. You
Yeah.
can only try your best at doing the little bit that you can contribute to change, and not feel bad about not being able to change your whole life. It's a tweak. Every new tweak is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, it's one of my favorite quotes from somebody here on YouTube named well, her name is Shelby, but Shell Bizzle or something like that. Um, she talks about sustainability and veganism and all that kind of stuff. And so she always says, you can't do everything the world needs, but the world needs everything that you can do. And so just recognizing that it doesn't have to be all or nothing, that it doesn't have to be perfect in order to be good, that we all have these systems of oppression that we have internalized and are trying to overcome, and that it's so much more impactful for you to be able to recognize that you have made a mistake, or that you have been internalizing this thing and addressing it, instead of just burying your head in the sand and pretending that it's not there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's something that a lot of people are kind of pulling their head out of the sand now, to be like, there
Yeah.
is stuff out here.
Yeah. And with what you were saying, I absolutely agree that having a support system, having a community is so, so important. You know, I'm so grateful that you and I were able to connect through Bees Women's Circle, which, like, that's my favorite thing to do each month. If you guys haven't checked it out, I'll link it below. Um, and like through these different femmes of color entrepreneurs that I've been able to connect to at university. I actually help run the People of Color Support and Solidarity group that we started in response to the protests in the summer. And having stuff like that is just so, so, so important, because this work is tough. It is a lot of being able to, it is messy, being able to recognize, like, oh shit, I have been benefiting from this system of oppression in this one way, or I have been internalizing and oppressed by this other system in another way. And so it's extremely, extremely messy to be able to recognize those things and be able to kind of come to terms with it and figure out, okay, how am I going to move forward from here?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's understanding. I think that's where learning about privilege is one of the first steps, or your intersections anyway. Where do you sit so
Yeah.
that you understand where you hold that power influence to make that first step in a space that is safe and accessible for you, and sustainable. Because if you're not
Yeah.
being overpowered in that space, then you can keep on creating that change for others rather than being the one trying to fight for that change for yourself, which takes a whole lot more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do want to point out a lot of people, just like the terms that I was talking about before with homophobia and misogyny, a lot of people get really triggered by the word privilege because they think, well, I have a hard life too. But it's like, privilege doesn't mean that you that you lead this perfect life with no problems. It means that you specifically are not impacted by this particular system of oppression. And so being able to recognize that you have privilege is not this dirty thing that means that you just like don't deserve good things in life. It means recognizing that you have been benefiting from a system that oppresses others and then saying, okay, what can I do in order to use my privilege to elevate the voices that have been silenced for so long, to dismantle these systems of oppression, to be able to overcome the internalized bigotry that I have kind of been fed my whole life.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I try to couch that word with influence and power because that's an easier place to come from. Where do I hold influence? Because if you do, it means that you're valued in that space and it means that you're safe in that space.
Mhm.
So thinking about it that way too can be a new in for how you choose to address things in those spaces.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's such a great way to explain it because it's like we're not asking you to like, you know, spend your entire life just like give everything up. We're not asking you to essentially like not have good things in life. We're asking you to instead see how you can use that power and influence to say, educate your coworkers or educate your buddy who keeps making racist jokes. Stuff like that. That's like just be able to speak up instead of being complacent and allowing it to continue.
Yeah, yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, and it's an accessible starting point. I'm like, you already have influence, which means you're already creating change in that space. So it just asks you to look at this change through a new eye. But yeah, and I think that applies to anybody that has influence. It's just
Yeah,
knowing what you do.
absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, I so appreciate you coming on today, and I'm so glad we were able to have this conversation. I will send you the recording so that you can put that up on your Instagram. Um, and yeah, is there anything you would like to promote at the end of this?
You can check me out on Instagram at danielagr.co. Daniela is with one L. It's Daniel with an A. But thanks so much for having me. I really enjoy these conversations because I feel like they leave me energized for the rest of the day and trying to process all of this and being really excited that other people are doing good work too all over the world.
Yeah,
So
me too.
thanks.
It's so exciting, like to be able to see that it's not just little old me trying to like against the world. It's a lot of us that are doing this work.
Yeah. So yeah, well, that's awesome. Well, thanks you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to go follow Daniela on her Instagram and be sure to join the Coven if you're wanting to participate in more conversations like these because we have them every single week in there.
That's
All right,
awesome.
everyone, have a safe weekend. Please wear masks, social distance, do all the
Yeah.
things, educate yourself, and we'll see you next week. Bye.